Good evening, everyone. It is now 5:02. We are going to get started in 2 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second of 2 online community workshops for short-term rentals. The purpose of hosting this online is to balance the health risks associated with the coronavirus while appreciating the public's input in a transparent and open manner during the current state of emergency. The public will not be able to physically attend the workshop. As a result, the city is hosting this online workshop as an opportunity for people to provide comments, feedback, and/or questions. Other alternative means of communication and feedback are also being considered to solicit additional input in the near future. My name is Nick Barant, and I will be hosting this workshop with my colleague, Karen Pan. We greatly appreciate your time and your commitment to serve your community, especially during the current situation. Both of us work in the Community Development Department. While we are tasked to design proposed regulations for short-term rentals, our main goal is to work together with all of you to ensure that we are building a safe, beautiful, and thriving community in Burbank. Please bear with us if we experience any technical difficulties. Tonight's workshop, which includes a presentation by staff as well as a period for questions and answers with participants, is scheduled to last for an hour and a half. Tonight's presentation is also live on YouTube. It will be recorded and rebroadcasted on the city's TV channel. As noted, you will have opportunities to share your input. There is a Q&A feature on the bottom of your computer or cell phone screen. At any time during the presentation, please type your question by clicking the Q&A icon. Answers to questions from attendees during the workshop will be posted on the city's website during the following days. During the workshop, there will also be times where we pause to see if anyone has any comments or questions. When that time period is available, we will ask you to click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. If there is not enough time, please make sure to provide your questions and comments in the Q&A icon. Those that are speaking will have a maximum of 1 minute during our Q&A sessions, and will only be able to speak once due to the time limitations. At any time, even after this workshop, you can contact Karen or myself. We will be providing our email address and phone number at the end, and they are also available online. For tonight's agenda, we will start with an overview of why we're here and go over a few definitions. We'll discuss our survey results, and then we'll dive into an overview of our proposed regulations, and then we'll move into the public input section of the meeting, which will involve a public comment period. We will close out with our next steps. Short-term rentals refer to renting out a housing unit in whole or in part for 30 days or less. Short-term rentals can be broken down into two categories. The first is home sharing. This is where a room is rented out. The unit's owner is typically present during this transaction. While this is a type of short-term rental, we do want to highlight that the City Council recently adopted an ordinance in February of 2020 to not allow accessory dwelling units to participate in short-term rentals. However, other rooms within a home are options for short-term rentals. The second category of short-term rental is a vacation rental. This is where the entire unit is rented out to guests with the owner absent. These are common in tourist destinations, including those communities that have beach houses or mountain cabins. Based on staff and consultant research, it is estimated that there are approximately 400 to 500 listings in a given year in the city, with an occupancy rate of approximately 33% or 1/3, and this is based on 2019 data. Now we're going to move into the results of our survey. We posted the survey about a month and a half ago, and it was open for approximately 4 weeks. We asked several questions. We won't be able to get to all of the questions, but we're going to present to you the highlights of the results that we obtained. The first question that we asked was, what best describes you? 86% of respondents said they were Burbank residents. 44% of respondents stated that they were property owners, 20% of respondents are renters, and 3% of respondents are non-Burbank residents. The second question was whether or not you live near a short-term rental. Most respondents did not know that they live near short-term rentals, while just over a quarter each of respondents said that they either lived or did not live near a short-term rental. We also asked whether or not respondents operated a short-term rental. 97 respondents did not stated that they did not operate a short-term rental, while 3% stated that they did. The next question was, in Burbank, how have short-term rentals impacted you and your family? About 11% of respondents indicated that short-term rentals positively impacted them and their families. A slight majority of respondents were neutral about the impact of short-term rentals, and about 36% of respondents indicated that their families were negatively impacted by short-term rentals. We then asked about concerns with short-term rentals, and the top 5 concerns chosen by respondents to the survey were parking, noise, large events, trash, and neighborhood character. We then asked if the city allowed short-term rentals with restrictions, which of the following would be appropriate regulations? Noise and time restrictions, limits on events, parking, occupancy, registration, and fines were the most popular regulations identified by respondents to the survey, with over 68%, with each of these categories receiving over 68% of the respondents' vote. We then asked our residents what their perspective on vacation rentals is. A slight majority of respondents believe that vacation rentals should be allowed, while a slight majority did not think that they should be allowed. We then asked about owner occupancy. Owner occupancy is defined as someone who lives and owns the same property. We asked respondents if an owner should be required to live on the property for their short-term rental listing. 63% of respondents said that the owner should live on their property that they rent out in whole or in part. 37% of respondents said that the owner does not need to live on their rental property. And lastly, we asked about if someone owns more than one residential property, should someone be allowed to use their additional residential properties as short-term rentals? 44% stated that someone who owns more than one residential property should be allowed to use their residential properties as their extra residential properties as short-term rentals, while 56% stated that only primary residencies should be available as short-term rentals. Now, before we get into our proposed ordinance, I'd like to remind everyone that what we're discussing tonight is not a finished product. We're here because we want your input. It is also not the comprehensive ordinance. What we're discussing tonight is an overview of the important components of the ordinance. It's not an exhaustive look at our regulations. I'd also like to add that personal experience and input from residents is an essential and meaningful part of this process. We wouldn't be where we are without you, and your input is crucial. What we present today may change based on your input and input from other stakeholders. We're going to start our discussion of the proposed ordinance with a general overview of the regulations. We're proposing to allow short-term rentals with a regulatory structure governing their operation in Burbank. Home sharing will be allowed, as will vacation rentals, but vacation rentals will have a 90-day cap on their operations. We will be requiring that any short-term rental operators have primary residency in their dwelling unit, meaning that a host must live in the unit that they are renting out for a majority of the year. This also means that a host cannot operate more than one short-term rental in Burbank. For hosts who want to engage in vacation rentals, this practically means that hosts will only be able to rent out their full unit while the host is on vacation. We're going to have a 10-minute brainstorming discussion on the previous slide. We're going to call on the first 4 people with their hands raised in the queue. You can also comment on the questions from others. If we don't get to your question, please type it into the Q&A so we can get to it after the workshop is finished. We will also have some time for questions and comments at the end of this presentation, time permitting.
Thank you, Nick, for providing everyone the results of the survey and the proposed regulations. At this time, we have a few people who have raised their hand. The first person that raised their hand is Karen Thornton. And Karen Thornton, you're allowed to talk for 1 minute.
My question is, who's going to be checking up on all this? Is there going to be a department in Burbank that oversees rentals, or is it just go to the building department, or what's the plan to monitor this?
Hi, Karen. Thank you for your question. We are going to get into this, I think, in future presentations of this, but right now the plan is for the regulation of short-term rentals to fall under the Building and Safety Division of the Community Development Department. However, this is also going to be something that touches a few different departments. We've had discussions across with our finance department, our police department, and members of our Building and Safety Division.
And Nick, to add to what you're saying, At the same time, while we're looking at proposed regulations, we're also looking for systems to help us identify and to track this information as accurate as possible. And so on the back end, we're looking for an online system for registration for this process, and we'll be able to identify those that have license and to be able to track this information. And thank you, Karen, for your question. The next hand that I see is Constantine. Constantine, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, and thank you all for putting this together. I appreciate it. My question is just on some of the data of the questions that were asked, the polling questions, specifically the one that said, do you know if you're near a short-term rental? And 25% of respondents said no, but then just like 3 or 4 slides prior, you showed a map of all the short-term rentals in Burbank. So obviously we're all pretty close to one, at least by looking at that map. So, I mean, this is going to affect everybody in the city, either, positively or negatively, which leads me to the next question on the data. Only 25% of respondents said, yes, they do live near a short-term rental that they know of. But then 34% of respondents said they had a negative impact for short-term rentals, which I don't understand that, because if only a quarter of the people know they live near one, how can a third of the people know that they've had a negative impact? So, the data is great. Thank you for putting the poll out there. I think I would just like to see more hard data rather than, the polling is great to do, but I just want to see more hard data moving forward. Thank you.
Constantine, so regarding the questions to the survey, all questions are open-ended, and from a perspective of someone who's responding to those questions, whether they know whether they're close to a short-term rental in their neighborhood, I think every household or every house has a different scenario where they do know, they don't know, and we wanted to have a general perspective when they were answering the second question about how they feel and how has short-term rental impacted them. And so whether they know or don't know whether they live next to a short-term rental, how they feel, whether it's positive or negative, can also be different as well. So both questions necessarily don't need to tie in together. It's just more of a general response of how they feel about it and whether they know or not know. And so you definitely see a different percentage between each question, and everyone has a different scenario of how short-term rental has impacted them, whether they know they live near one.
Thank you.
The next person is Michael. Michael, you may speak. You have 1 minute.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm interested to know, with the 400 to 600 illegal providers presently today, what research tells you that if this becomes permitted, that these people are going to register? Because from what I understood from watching council meetings, they were quite excited about a potential for $600,000 in transient occupancy tax. But if we have 400 to 600 people doing it now illegally, what makes us believe we're going to be able to collect from those folks? Thank you.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for your question. I think one of the goals we have in crafting these regulations is to make it as easy as possible for our residents to register. And we want to make we want to have both the carrot and the stick of our regulation. The carrot being making it easy to register and easy to get a business license to do this. And we want to make the remittance of the transient occupancy tax to the city as easy as possible, while having a stick of non-compliance high enough that we want to drive people to register on their own volition. We don't want the penalties to be too high so that they just completely stop, or that the barrier of registration is too high so that they just completely stop. We want those who are operating illegally right now to be able to register without any trouble, essentially.
Thank you.
I see another hand that's raised. Claire, you have 1 minute.
Hi, this is actually Caleb. I'm using my wife's computer. Thanks. What I wanted to bring up also was about enforcement. We're currently dealing with a short-term rental on next door to us, and what we're finding is, like, I called the code enforcement office today and just basically voiced my concerns, saying, hey, we're having problems with noise, with trash, with in and outs all day. They basically replied to me saying, unless I can prove it, she said, people coming in and out of the house all day does not mean there's a short-term rental going on. She said, if someone has a loud party, that doesn't mean a short-term rental is going on. So she basically said, the burden of proof is on me, to say this is what's going on. So I guess my comment is, as far as it's working right now, it's almost impossible for me to prove. So there is no incentive for my neighbor basically to register because no one can stop them. That's my comment. Thank you.
Hi, Caleb. Thank you for your comment. One of the reasons we want to have this create a regulatory structure is so that residents, hosts who are residents, and visitors have a level playing field, and so that they know how to essentially call the city and tell them that an illegal short-term rental operation is happening next door, so that the city can enforce them to enforce the rules, as it were.
And you brought up a really good point. Through this process, we have received several questions very similar to what you're asking. And internally, with the proposed regulations, we're figuring out what that process and response will look like. And you'll see through the other slides that there's regulations for, during your business hours and also after hours, and what resources are available to help respond. And, with cases with complaints with short-term rental, you're right, it's hard to, find the burden of proof, and sometimes it's at a specific moment, and we want to simplify that process also for the public as well. So if there is a situation, regardless of what time it is, there'll be a mechanism where it'll be just a call. And if there is more information about a complaint, whether it's through pictures or being able to contact someone through the city, those will definitely help. And there will be an internal process and a resource where residents are able to call in and file their complaint regardless of the time or the scenario.
Okay, that makes sense. We have a relationship with the neighbor, and my initial complaints fall on to her, just saying, hey, this has happened and this has happened. Is there any way you can just kind of, try to keep a better eye on it for you? And basically the responses we've been getting is, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Large parties are not part of our policy. but sometimes they happen. We're sorry for, just sort of a number of things, but it brings up sort of another point I wanted to make is we've also suspected that there's been sort of a misuse of the intention of the short-term rental. We obviously, the burden of proof is on me and I can't prove any of this, but when we see people coming in almost on the hour, we see film or video equipment coming in and out of the house. How do you prove that there's not also misuse of the intention of a vacation rental, i.e. of filming, video shoots, perhaps adult film, perhaps hourly massage, or somebody's renting the house temporarily to do casting? I mean, how do we prove, kind of all of these discrepancies in what the intention of this setup is supposed to be?
That's a great point, and that's something that we've been thinking about during the crafting of these regulations, and we expect to get to it in some future slides. But in the very short term, I will say that we plan on banning any sort of external use outside of short-term rentals from occurring at these residences or these rental properties. In terms of enforcing such a mechanism, we are going to be working with a contractor who should be able to identify and track short-term rental operations for us. For things like events, we're also going to have to be a little bit more reactive with our enforcement. Pictures and documentation from neighbors will be critical for that. And in terms of, and we will get to the enforcement section of this regulatory structure in a few slides, where we'll describe what happens if hosts violate the terms of their business license, or if they violate any of the municipal code ordinances that we plan on creating for this.
Yes, and you're definitely ahead of the game with our slides. With the proposed regulations, we want to be able to clearly define what those parameters are, so it's clear to everyone, whether you're a resident or a host or a visitor, what you can and cannot do, and that there would be a clear direction of what the path looks like if you were to violate the regulations. And if it's okay, those are our 4 questions, and that's 10 minutes. Do you want to move on to the next slides? All right. Thank you, everyone.
And just to be clear, if you have more questions relating to the first slide, enter them into the Q&A section. We will get to them after the presentation is over, and we will post our responses on the city website. The proposed regulatory structure will start with a business license that every short-term rental operator would be required to obtain. Licensees would be required to pay annual fees to keep their license up to date. Every operator will also be required to list their license number on their short-term rental advertisement. While the details of the application process have yet to be ironed out, we expect that the city will provide in advance a checklist to all prospective short-term rental operators so that they clearly understand what is expected in their license application. We're going to have another 10-minute brainstorming intermission to discuss the previous slide. So if you have any questions, please raise your hands now. Like the first intermission, you will have 1 minute to ask a question. You can also comment on questions from others, and we will take 4 questions before we move on.
Nick, our next speaker is Jana. Jana, you have 1 minute.
Hi, thank you guys. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Okay, so going back to, it's actually the same type of question that Karen asked off of the first slide, which is, who is going to be checking this? This is an area that could be checked fairly easy from a licensing division. But again, if there was a clearinghouse or a one-stop shop where all of these different areas can be into a database where they can check for infractions and they can check for the abuses that people are calling in, how many police reports, how many times have people called to complain, that's going to help the city really narrow these down. So checking on that license renewal and if they see certain infractions or constant abuse, then you can start being able to field out penalties to them as well.
Thank you for your comment, Jana. That's very helpful. That's something that we have been looking into with the contractors that we've been talking to who help cities, counties, and other municipalities regulate short-term rentals. Essentially, what these contractors do is build a licensing and registration database where cities they essentially provide the online infrastructure and database infrastructure that allow cities to regulate short-term rentals. They also they have that kind of tracking software where if a renewal comes in and we can see how many different violations or infractions have occurred at a specific address, or that they haven't paid their transient occupancy taxes or just haven't been keeping up with the terms of their license, and we can use that to either require or we can use that to demand that they bring their license up to date or that they pay their TOT, or we can deny a renewal of their license based on past poor behavior.
And including like parking and things like that, because we had a big issue with that, as you guys both know. And the way that it was being handled, and someone in the police department was saying, oh, it's this division, and another one said it was another division, and we went around and around and around, and then the tenants left, and it's like, great, good job, guys. So again, if it could all tie together to one clearinghouse, one department, I think that's going to be the best way for the city to track. And I think the residents might agree with that. I'm not going to answer for anybody but myself, of course, and my husband, but I think that is just key to the success of this, and not just revenue building, but to overall protect the residents of the city.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I should have made that a little more clear. The Building and Safety Division will be handling, or will be the division that does or oversees all of the regulation. They will be working with other division or other departments within the city. However,
so they'll be working with police and all, because before, yes, code enforcement told me they only do that. They only do code enforcement. I have to contact another person for traffic or parking and another person for noise. And I just said that's so ineffective. And it just, unless you're going to produce a laundry list of phone numbers and who to call, it's just much more effective to have one group. So if code enforcement's it for all code, that'll be cool.
Yes, thank you so much for your comment, Jana.
Thank you.
And I see another hand, Anthony. Anthony, you have 1 minute.
Hello. So I have quite a few Airbnbs. Actually, I own 5 properties here in Burbank, and they also have ADUs that I've done the legal ADU route. My main property, I live in the ADU and I do Airbnb the front house. I know the ADUs are not permitted to be take part in Airbnb, so I rent those out long term and then I Airbnb the front house on them. I guess one of the questions I have is, are you guys in favor of doing this or not? Because I just feel like it's kind of a blurred line. At the beginning, you guys seem like you were in favor of doing Airbnb and short-term rentals and whatnot, but now the regulations you're putting into place are kind of the antithesis of that, because who really is going to do a 90-day short-term rental when they go on vacation and let people wander around their own personal house? It just doesn't seem, like something people are just going to do. And that's one question. Another question is, if someone is to live in my situation in an ADU and to rent out the front house, I do currently live on the property and I can maintain the property and their house is with parking. It's just, I don't know. I don't know. I guess my question is just that. So yeah, thanks.
So Anthony, I just want to make sure that I clarify what the previous slide was regarding proposed regulations and council's direction. For short-term rentals, the direction and the proposed regulation will say that short-term rentals is allowed. Home sharing will be allowed. So someone can rent out a room, and to give you an example, there could be someone who, is just needing a room for a few nights because they have a business meeting. They'll be able to rent out a specific unit within a house. And the proposed regulation will also allow people to rent out their whole house, which is referred to vacation rental, and it can go up to 90 days. So that could be a number of listings that can happen, but it's just not one person for 90 days. It could be multiple people. It's just up to 90 days per year. And regarding your second question about, which unit you live, right now, how we have our proposed regulation is that it's your primary residency, and whatever your primary residency is, you'll be able to use that address to be registered as a business license to operate as a short-term rental. And you're right, we probably need to clarify more of what primary residency means, and we'll definitely do that. Did I answer your question, Anthony?
Yeah, I understand. I just wanted to make sure. At the beginning of this, I really felt like you and Nick were pushing to approve short-term rentals and kind of, I don't want to say be on our side or sides or anything like that. I'm looking at the feasibility of it and whether or not, like someone stated before, whether it's going to push someone to do it or not. And then you had Karen and the other lady who was mentioning regulations and complaining, and you can always have someone who just specifically doesn't like you and they're going to complain about everything, and regardless of Airbnb or not, it's hard. I guess these are questions that will only be answered in time. But yeah, I appreciate you responding. So thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And we have other hands, and I see Jana and Kara. Jana or Kara, do you guys want to comment on that? You guys are unmuted. How about Kara?
Kara, can you hear us?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Okay, perfect. I really want to be supportive of folks being able to rent out their property and rent out their room, because especially in this time, we all need the extra income. However, being a homeowner in Burbank, I'll be honest, it's having somebody rent out a property across from me or next door to me impacts my life. It impacts it every day. I would hope that there would be some consideration for the neighbors that will be impacted by these decisions by the city. I know there are always really good intentions with what people will say that will or won't happen. However, I can tell you I didn't spend a lot of money to live in Burbank to live by a mini hotel with minimal regulations and follow-up. And that's what makes it really tough. Because, in our case, I've got people coming and going all hours of the day and night. I got trash left out, parties. I mean, our neighbors almost joke that we must have a drug house across the street because there's this much going on all the time. And I don't want to classify everybody as being in that, same arena. I think there's a lot of, really responsible people, but it absolutely has to be regulated and enforced. And like the other lady said, it needs to be done through one department because unfortunately the city has a history of bouncing you around from department to department. And I can tell you, I won't deal with that if that's the case, as I'm sure other people won't. Because I got parties going on across the street in COVID time. Really? Not smart. But these are the people that are renting out the house, at least across from me. So I just ask that you think about stuff like that. It has to be regulated.
Kara, thank you for your comment. Impacts on neighbors is something that we've thought about a lot during the crafting of these proposed regulations, and it's something that we will look further into. Some cities have some sort of neighbor notification provisions, and that's something that we can consider as we move forward.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We'll take one more. Jana, you have 1 minute.
Hi, thank you. I just want to kind of echo what Karen was saying because we've had a similar situation as well here, and it really is about the residents and these people that are doing their businesses. They don't care about the individual neighbors because the people that owned the home that we were dealing with obviously didn't care because it's been going on for more than a year, and especially since COVID started, and it was a revolving door, and we would call and ask for help, and people were contacting the owners, and once in a while there might have been something happening, but until a huge incident happened with the police, and they had to come over and stop a violent act that took place on one of the party goers. This never happened. Nobody cared. So for people like Anthony, who obviously is the owner, he said, of these types of places, to say that the city has been pushing to approve the short-term rentals, that concerns me. And he said, actually, Karen and Nick, and I'm confused by that because I thought, we're in a safe zone to be able to discuss these and brainstorm and talk about ways to better protect the residents. Sure, everyone would love to make more money, but some people have been making money and didn't care a thing about the residents. And so that's what I want to make sure is that when we're looking at the impact on this, it's not just the impact on these owners who are making the money, it's the impact on the residents that live here, have decided to make Burbank their homes. Those are the people that have to be taken into account, I think even more so than these people who are running businesses. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Jana. It's very much appreciated. Okay, we're going to move on. Next, we're going to discuss hosting platform responsibilities. Hosting platform, for those who might not know, hosting platforms are the online companies that provide the infrastructure to let hosts rent out their units. These include companies like Airbnb, VRBO, and HomeAway. Hosting platforms will have responsibilities under our regulatory structure as well. Hosting platforms will be required to collect the transient occupancy tax and send it to the city on behalf of their hosts. Hosting platforms will be required to not permit anyone to rent out their property unless it is listed on the city's registry. And finally, hosting platforms will also need to disclose who lists their properties on their platforms. Hosts will have a set of responsibilities as well. Hosts must be available by phone during a stay. Hosts must provide the city with either their own phone number or designate someone who will be present during any guest stay so that any issue may be resolved promptly. Second, advertisements must not be visible to the public on the host's property. And third, the city is proposing to have several safety provisions that the host must abide by. Hosts will be required to have an operational fire extinguisher, working carbon monoxide and smoke detectors, as well as a fire evacuation map posted in their rental unit. Hosts that are not on a hosting platform must also remit their transient occupancy tax to the city. Hosts will also need to provide information about trash disposal to guests. Trash from short-term rental operations should not be visible from the street. Hosts will also need to provide parking spots for their guests. The details of this regulation are still being worked out, and we will have more details to come. Our proposed ordinance will also include maximum occupancy rules, which are that there shall not be more than 2 adults per bedroom listed and a 16-guest maximum, whichever is smaller. For example, if a host renting out 2 bedrooms in their 3-bedroom house could not have more than 4 adult guests. For another example, a host renting out a 9-bedroom house could not allow more than 16 guests, even though they have 9 bedrooms. The 16-guest maximum is consistent with a recent Airbnb regulation. Hosts will also be required to obtain general liability insurance or host on a platform that can provide insurance. Okay, we are going to have another 10-minute brainstorming intermission. Like the previous ones, we will provide 1 minute to ask questions, and you can comment on the questions from others, and we will take 4 questions or comments before we move on.
I see one hand, and it's Erin. Erin, you have 1 minute.
Hi, thank you so much. So I'm concerned because our dearest friends, we live in Burbank, and our dearest friends live a few blocks away from us, also in Burbank, and they're dealing with what's a nightmare situation at this point. Only about a month ago, the house next door became a short-term rental. There are people coming and going every few days, every day. The house is not listed on Airbnb. So wherever it's listed, it's attracting people looking to use it for daytime activities like filming. It's all-day meetings, and I can only offer my assumptions as to what they are, so I won't say, and parties. It's so bad that their 9-year-old will no longer go play in the yard because their house and this other house are so tight and close together that she's, sitting there with like 4 or 5 men having beers next door to her. So what once was her tight-knit community and her safe space is no longer. The problem is there is nowhere for them to effectively report what's happening, as the homeowners have, for all intents and purposes, checked out. And so they are uncomfortable and almost jailed in their own home at this point. So my question to you is, already these things are happening. Already they're causing troubles, and they're reshaping communities, as well as reducing long-term housing for families in Burbank, which is an issue. So my question is, will the enforcement and the process for management of these situations be put into place and practice with best practices prior to moving forward.
Thank you, Erin, for your question, and let me know if I don't answer your question. So regarding the situation that is in your neighborhood, if you don't mind letting us know the address and we could look into it. And we are seeing through this process and from speaking to other departments and staff of existing complaints that relate to short-term rentals. Knowing the situation and seeing what the situation is definitely helps us have clear regulations for the proposed regulations. We have seen that there are different scenarios where people have been using their house for different purposes, whether it be daytime or nighttime. And so the more information that you can provide to us so we know what's going on, such as something that's happening on the front property, dealing with safety, any suggestions that you have as well would be helpful for the proposed regulations because there are scenarios that differ. And when it comes to enforcement, we are hearing a lot of comments about it. And with the regulations, we want to be able to define those. And what we're hearing from the public, whether it's through this workshop and emails that we're getting, is that residents really want to be have regulations where it holds the hosts accountable for what they're doing, and to have a one-stop shop for people to be able to call in one number, not multiple numbers, to resolve an issue. And it doesn't matter what time or what the use is or what they're violating. Something to simplify the process for a resident to be able to complain, to simplify the process for someone to register, and a process where the city is able to track this information and easily available regardless of what department you're in police or building and safety, dealing with the scenario, and to make sure that there's clear communication across the board is what I'm hearing. And so we are trying to work on our end on enforcement and finding resources. This is it's a new industry, but it's an industry that has been here for a while in the last 10 or 15 years. And so there's mechanism that's out there to be able to create this understanding and process regardless of how short-term rental impacts you. And so we are looking at, a phone number, one phone number, regardless of what time, someone will be able to respond to a complaint. Does that help answer your question?
It surely does. I mean, I just want to emphasize the importance of having that piece in place first, and for the consequence to be something that would deter anyone from breaking the law. I mean, if you can afford it, if it's lucrative for you to be renting your house out by the day, every few days, for whatever, if you're already uncomfortable, especially now, bending the rules because it's profitable to you, I just hope that the consequence is severe enough to deter it. And I also completely understand that this is something that needs to be thought through and considered. But it shouldn't be on me or my friends or their daughter even to be the one out there sort of managing the situation, which makes it so important. And I'm very grateful to you for having included in this first proposal the fact that the homeowner must live on site. Because I think that will make all the difference. Right now, there's really no one for my friends to go to. They're just stuck and their daughter can't go outside. But if the homeowner did live on the property, it would allow them the opportunity to have a face-to-face masked conversation, if you will, in this environment. So my emphasis is on, please, let's prioritize what the enforcement will look like, how that works. Reach out to other communities dealing with this and find out what did or did not work for them before we put something into place. Only because I'm personally witnessing the severity of the consequences for some really good people who've lived in Burbank and are very devoted to this community and have been here for a very long time. So thank you.
Thank you. And to add to that, on the back end, Nick and I are, for the past year, we've been reaching out to neighboring cities on how implementation has been going for them and how they've been operating their regulations to get best practices and what works and what doesn't work for them. And so that's definitely in the works to be considered.
Thank you.
We have a next speaker. It's labeled as TA. It's either TA or TA. You have 1 minute to speak. TA, are you there? Just in case, I'll move on to the next speaker.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Sorry, that took a minute. I have a question, comment, and then a request. My question is, has the city attorney attended any of these meetings? That's my question. My comment is, it sounds like you, not you personally, but the city is absolutely adamant about moving forward with this. So rather than fight it, I would like to know exactly how you plan on prosecuting. You can make as many ordinances as you want to. If they're unenforceable, it means nothing to me as a homeowner and someone who is currently dealing with the situation. And so I would like the city attorney, bring Chris and Andrea from code enforcement as well. You might as well. I would like them to address us and tell us exactly how they plan on prosecuting any violations. And Chris and Andrea have been known to ask for receipts and proof and things that the average person cannot provide. And it's not our job to do so. That's why we have a code enforcement. That's why we have a city attorney. So I want to know what their commitment is to prosecuting, to keeping an eye on these things and making sure things don't get out of control.
Thank you for your comment and questions. So we have been working with the city attorney's office on this issue. We actually just had a meeting with them yesterday or a couple of days ago. They have been kept in the loop on all of our developments. I know that Chris and Andrea are going to work very hard with regulating this. They are consummate professionals, and I expect them to do the very best job when this is implemented.
And in the, I don't know if it's the next slide or upcoming in the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about enforcement and where we are with that. We are getting a lot of comments about, and just through the workshop itself right now, people want to know what enforcement looks like. And we'll go into detail of what the status update is regarding the proposed regulations for that. You're ahead of the game.
I would like someone from PD to be there as well, because these are serious questions. If I've got someone next door throwing a 50-person rager and I call the cops, I want to know exactly how those people will be removed from the house that night, not the next day, or not that will notify the owner that there's been a violation, because there needs to be real action in real time, not a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or when we get around to prosecuting this person or fining them or talking to them. So it would be helpful for us to know from PD, from code enforcement, and from the city attorney exactly how they plan on addressing violations in real time.
Thank you for your comment. When we get to that slide, we'll respond to you where we are with that. And then we'll make sure to take note that you're looking for clear consequences of how to deal with the situation in real time.
And just to add to that very briefly, we can also include the police department and code enforcement in subsequent presentations to whether that be planning board or city council to address those very issues.
if anyone wants to comment on that, you may do so, or if you want to ask your questions, feel free. The next person that I see is Claire.
Yes, this is Caleb again. Yeah, just to bring up another point with the enforcement, you had commented earlier that documentation from neighbors will be sort of important or critical in your investigations. What will that look like? What is my job in this as a concerned neighbor?
Caleb, very similar to what the process is now, where if someone were to complain about something and they were to go to code enforcement staff, depending on the scenario, sometimes it's just a quick call where you're able to provide information. Sometimes there's scenarios where you have pictures because of whatever the situation is. It's drastic and you want to be able to document it. I think from a code enforcement perspective, any information that a resident might have or a business might have and wants to complain about something where someone is violating a city code or a regulation, that is always helpful. Just like anytime you were to complain or report something of a situation, more information is always better. And with the short-term rental, we're hoping to create more of a streamlined process, knowing that situations might come and hit multiple departments, whether it's attorney's office or police or code enforcement staff or even public works, that there would be just one number to remember when a scenario comes up. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no worries. Just want to make sure I answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. I'm definitely in favor of sort of one catch-all phone number, so we're not sort of trying to chase down whether it's PD or code enforcement. But I can say with my personal experience with code enforcement that, again, it was my firsthand accounts of what are violations to, I guess, my sort of safety and security and well-being were sort of met with this attitude of unless I can prove it. And, basically what I have to do now is go through my phone and find text messages from the property owner where she's sort of admitted that she's short-term renting the house and submit it to the city. And I don't know if all concerned neighbors or neighbors that are negatively impacted are going to have all of this hard evidence. And it just feels like, if you're not going to take firsthand accounts seriously, and again, I understand, people can get frustrated with loud parties and maybe exaggerate the truth. And this isn't, sort of a state we want to be in our neighborhoods. But at the same time, I don't feel like it's my job to be a private investigator or a detective in my own yard. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to comment on that? Or and we'll take one more comment or question. And I see Michael.
Yes, good afternoon. It is to comment on what was just stated. First of all, Nick, I appreciate the work and the effort you guys are putting in this, but when you said when this is implemented, if I'm not mistaken, this has to go to the planning board and then it's got to go to the city council. So the publics will have a few more platforms to speak, unless I'm mistaken. And the other thing is, and I appreciate the fact that Karen brought up the fact you're looking at best practices, because if you look at Palm Springs, Indian Wells, Palm Desert, and the beach cities, they've been through this. And if you look at what they have now, it's 30 days or greater. These short-term rentals had turned their neighborhoods into mayhem. So hopefully we'll learn from others' mistakes so that we in Burbank can be fortunate enough not to go through those mistakes. But I really do appreciate the fact you're holding these meetings and that there will be 2 more, I think, public input sessions, at least for the Planning Commission, which makes decisions, and the City Council. Thank you very much.
Yes, Michael, I'm sorry, I misspoke when what I meant was in the event that this is implemented, not when this is implemented.
I understand completely.
The Planning Commission and the City Council meetings are scheduled for November and then December, respectively, and we expect there to be lots of public comments about this in both of those arenas. And we also have been looking at lots of other cities, beach cities included. Santa Monica is one of the cities we've been looking at, as well as Los Angeles, West Hollywood, and Glendale, and Ventura.
And Michael will definitely add Palm Spring and Indian Wells to the list, and we'll contact them.
Thank you.
Okay, we are going to move on to our next slide. Our proposed ordinance and regulatory structure will include provisions that prohibit events at short-term rentals, meaning no commercial events, no group gatherings, or parties will be allowed. Weddings will not be allowed as well. We would like to keep the only business happening at the short-term rental to be that of the short-term rental itself. We're also proposing quiet hours of 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., and our ordinance would also make changes to the transient occupancy tax section of our code, which would require that guests and visitors pay the transient occupancy tax, much like hotel guests currently do. Okay, we are going to have one more 10-minute brainstorming intermission. Like all the others, you'll have 1 minute to ask a question. You can comment on questions from others, and we will take 4 questions before we move on.
I see Anthony. Anthony, you have 1 minute.
Just a quick question. Gatherings would, I would assume, be more than the allotted 16 people, correct? Because I just feel like 3's a crowd to some people, type of thing.
So just to clarify, and I want to make sure both Karen and I understand this question. So say there's a short-term rental that only allows, that has 2 bedrooms in it, so only 4 people can be present at that short-term rental. What you're asking, are you asking if they bring over 12 people, is that allowed? Or are you asking for about the number of people staying there that night?
I'm asking the former. I'm just assuming, because there were 16 people maximum per house, but gatherings, I guess it's nitpicky, but I'm just wondering gatherings in general, you know what I mean? I'm assuming it would be the more than the 4 people that would be allowed to spend the night, correct?
You know, I got to be honest with you, that's something that we haven't totally thought through. That's a good question, and we'll have to return back to you on, or get back to you at a later date with an answer to that. And that's something that we can, if you wouldn't mind, could you pose that as a question in the Q&A so that we know to get to it?
Sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
The next person I see is Aaron.
Hi, yes. Oh, so for starters, Anthony asked such a good question. I think that's going to be really important to answer. I live in a 1,000 square foot home. My friends I'm referring to in this situation, the house next to them is probably around 700 square feet. So 16 people would absolutely be a party. So yes, and thank you. And I'm looking forward to us being really particular about those details. But my real question here is in regard to the housing shortage in Burbank. So I know that there's been a lot of efforts around that. Many different committees involved in conversations around how we're going to solve for the housing shortage in Burbank. And I know that the ADUs were one of those solutions that were recently passed. So with this adjustment and the ability, especially in a COVID environment where people are concerned about long-term tenants, given that anyone's income is at risk, are you guys working with some of those other committees to consider how we're going to balance the potential unrest and like unbalance now that we're causing to the efforts made in order to help with that housing shortage through ADUs, et cetera.
Erin, regarding housing shortage and with short-term rental, both topics relate to each other, and both don't connect with each other at the same time. And so you're definitely seeing two different approaches that the city is taking. There's, initiative to address the housing shortage, to be able to provide more housing, affordable housing. And then you also see this approach where, there's proposed regulations to allow short-term rental. I definitely see the connection, just like you, on, what does it mean when we allow short-term rental and how does it impact the affordable housing? And we're definitely seeing those two things happening at the same time. So for short-term rental, it's a market that's currently helping, and we're hoping that, it exists. With proposed regulations, people can make a more firm decision whether they want to participate through a business license and operate one, or whether they don't. And through this process, you might, and right now, at this point, we don't know if we're going to get more people registering for license because we allow it, or whether we're going to get less license because now we allow it and there's regulation and then there's fees that you got to pay now. From talking to other neighboring cities, they also know what to anticipate on the number of short-term rentals in their cities. And what they're seeing is, for right now, that there's less people registering for their business license. And it could be a variety of factors. And a lot of cities have commented on it, trying to get people to register because they're able to identify those addresses. And some of them have chosen not to participate or not to have a short-term rental anymore because of the costs that the city is enforcing. And then there might be situations where someone says, that's great, that's a process, I want to be part of that process and get a license, and I understand what the rules are. And so definitely you're seeing different factors hit in terms of short-term rental and how people view the regulation process. And it just happens that both approaches are happening at the same time, knowing that there are people who have listings today and are taking away units for people to live in. There's definitely some sort of connection between both, and both have some sort of validity. Some people use short-term rental because of income, and so there's that factor as well. And so both are just happening at the same time. And affordable housing, the city has certain goals on, how to get more affordable housing and more housing as well. And hopefully that responds to your question.
In the same vein, in the conversations you've had where people have been looking at this in other cities, have they seen the impact that it's had on turning over of houses, like the number of houses listed? Like, are people, instead of listing their home and turning it over to a new family, are they turning to short-term rentals instead as an income?
We haven't heard that, but that's something that we can continue to look into on our end.
Cool, thank you.
I see Kara. Kara, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up one additional item, which is kind of unique, but I can't imagine we're the only folks who have this issue. In our case, we have a renter who's actually renting out the additional rooms. So if you fall on the homeowner actually having to live there, is the plan to have a quote unquote renter able to substitute for that homeowner? And what's the accountability for those who refuse to get a license but still continue to operate? And what's your provision for what's evidence? Because like the other gentleman, I don't want to be a backyard detective. But if somebody sat on my front lawn all day, they'd be amazed at what I see every day thanks to COVID. So just wanted to make sure those items are addressed.
I'm sorry, Kara, could you repeat your question?
Well, it was kind of a multi-parter. So, will a renter who's legally renting the house from the owner be considered as the quote unquote owner if they are also renting out rooms to other people?
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah. So with regards to renters, what we're thinking about in regards to this regulation is that any renter who wants to use their, rent out a room in their apartment unit that they're renting or rent out their house, what we're looking at is requiring that they demonstrate landlord approval before they go forward with their application. And what that would look like is essentially a signed statement from their landlord that says that they are allowing the rent or the lessor to use their property as a short-term rental. With regards to enforcement, that's something that we're going to get into a little bit more in our next slide. And in terms of evidentiary standards, that's something that we're going to have to go back and talk to both our code enforcement and our police department about. It's something that we need a little more input on. So thank you for bringing that to our attention.
No, I appreciate it. Because just to put this out there so you understand really quickly, because I know we're running close on time. When I talked to the city, they originally said that I had to provide receipts from the renters, even though the stuff was online that anybody could see. So I think they really need to standardize what they need and go by that versus by the individual judgment of the person you're speaking to.
Yes, thank you. That's a great point. We appreciate it. So regarding enforcement, we plan to have a series of escalating fines for violations of the ordinance, as well as suspensions and revocations of licenses. And we'd also like to make clear that violating the Burbank Municipal Code is a misdemeanor, which carries a penalty of up to a $1,000 fine, up to 6 months in county jail, or some combination of both of those things. And we haven't, just to briefly talk about this before we go into our next brainstorming intermission, the fines have yet to be determined because we want to sort of strike a balance between being enough of a stick to get compliance without being overly burdensome. While we understand there is a desire to have fines be very high, we can't make them so high that they get tossed out in a court of law, essentially. That being said, we also don't want them so low that the violators would just pay the fine and be done with it and continue on with their bad behavior. So striking the balance between being high enough to generate compliance but low enough that they aren't overly burdensome is what we're looking for in our in the next step of our research.
Nick, it's 6:21, and I think we only have one more slide. And let me just double check next steps. Do you want to go over next steps, and then we'll open it up for public comment?
Yes, let's do that. So for our next steps, we will be sharing the results of our survey on the short-term rental part of our city's website. Staff will also be working with hosting platforms, and we anticipate that the proposed ordinance will be presented to the planning board and the city council, or at the city's planning board in November of 2020 and at the city council in December of 2020. And those are our next steps. So what we're going to do now is take public comment for about 15 more minutes, and then we will conclude the presentation.
I see Martin. Martin, you have 1 minute.
No, 2 minutes now.
Oh, sorry. This is public comment. You have 2 minutes.
Hello, this is Martin. First of all, I just want to say I really am appreciative of the thoughtful conversation and the sharing that's happening on this really important subject. I wanted to share another perspective that I haven't heard tonight. As somebody who has used short-term rentals in travels abroad with my wife and my son, I do have to say there's a value to short-term rentals. It really allows you to experience a place in a different way than you would if you're in a sterile hotel environment. You know, from being able to go to the round the corner coffee shop or the supermarket and just cook at home. For us, actually, it even allowed us to take along my mother-in-law and let her come along for pretty much no extra charge. So I want to make sure that there are obviously bad apples here, and that there are things going on that are completely unacceptable in our neighborhoods. I want to make sure that doesn't overshadow that there are probably many, many more travelers who are wonderful people, good people, who just want to find an alternative way to experience Burbank than the other ways would be able to. Thank you.
Martin, thank you so much for your comment. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and with any comments that anyone has regarding short-term rental through an email or through the survey, all that information is going to be shared as we go through the process with planning board and city council. So if there's anything that you want to share, or even through the Q&A, those will be available for those who are making the decisions for the regulations. And I just wanted to add that. And thank you, Martin. The next hand that I see is Tamala. Tamala, you have 1 minute. Oh,
Great,
2 minutes, sorry.
Okay, thank you. I have a few questions. My first question is, there are websites that allow individuals to rent out their pools, office space, filming space, meeting space by the hour. Would this ordinance cover those kinds of services and rental terms? My second question is, you had mentioned earlier in the presentation that this particular ordinance would limit the number of days that a short-term rental could be rented a year to 90 days per year. Are you saying that means there's no full-time situation where a property would be rented out to do short-term rentals through the whole year? It's not allowed. And then if that's true, how would the city keep track of how many days people are renting out their space, especially if they use multiple platforms? And then my third question is, for clarification, for rental spaces that are apartments, condos, or multiplexes, are those allowed to have short-term rentals in those buildings, or are those not allowed because they're not, or are they allowed if somebody lives in one of the apartments, or how are those categorized in the ordinance that you propose? Thank you.
Hi, Tamala. Thank you for your questions. With regards to renting out pools or rooms in your house for meetings, that's something that we're still taking under advisement. That was brought to our attention very recently, and that's an issue we need to give a little bit more thought to with how it might fall under the ordinance and the regulations that we are developing. With regards to the 90-day limit, we are envisioning that the 90-day limit will apply to vacation rentals only. For those who want to rent out a single room in their house, they will have no such limit. The way we can enforce that with the vacation rentals is through one of the contractors that we have been investigating with to help the city regulate short-term rentals. They have essentially means of and algorithms that can check how many days out of the previous week a short-term rental has been rented out for. And we can use that data to essentially determine how many days a short-term rental has been used in a given calendar year. And Karen is going to answer your final question about condos and apartment complexes.
So regarding condos, apartment complexes, multifamily, that's an area that we're still working through. Right now, we're thinking that if they have permission from their landlord, they'll be allowed to participate in operating a short-term rental. And if they are, then it would be part of the requirement as their business license to show proof of that and to be able to have approval on an annual basis. So even though you get approval for one time, technically you would need to do it on an annual basis. But that part is still gray and we're looking at it. We are looking at how neighboring cities also do it. Since multifamily, we are seeing a number of people use, whether it's a condo or apartment, for short-term rental. That's something that we're still going to look at, including the pools as well. That's a new type of market that we're seeing.
And just to add one more thing, specifically for condos or condominiums, the homeowners association might already ban that type of activity. And if that's the case, then the homeowners association, I think, would have enforcement mechanisms as well.
Tamala, did we answer all your questions? I just want to make sure.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I see one more hand, and it's Jana. Jana, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks again. Going back to the enforcement slide that we didn't get to comment on, and it's outlining some of the punitive treatment for violators, but I just wanted to make sure that someone is going to also visit changing the Burbank Municipal Code as far as the parking allowances as they stand now, so that maybe even a subsection for short-term rentals, because we've had some very interesting guests pretty much across the street that have caused a lot of concern, and the police did not do anything other than drive by on a couple of different occasions. So that was one point. The second point was, I know you're talking about a maximum number of days per year being 90, but I didn't hear the minimum number. What are we, where are you at as far as the minimum required number of days for a stay, so that we're not having the revolving door? And then lastly, as to what Martin said, in Europe situation or traveling, it's very different in Europe. The people are, it's just a whole different deal. And I completely agree the way they handle things. It's just not, it's not a party zone. You're renting these wonderful homes and you're getting them for whatever, a week or 2 weeks, whatever you're staying. It's just handled so much differently than what our current experience is. So those were my 3 areas. And thank you both again, Karen and Nick, for chairing this committee and workshop.
Thank you, Jana, for your comment. With regards to parking, that's it's one of the trickier parts of our regulations is building out the parking components of it. And it's a discussion that I'm going to be having with our Assistant Director of Transportation in the coming weeks. We're thinking of having some sort of parking minimums that are off street, but the details of those have yet to be worked out. With regards to minimum stays, that's something that we haven't thought about yet, but we will take it under advisement. We haven't seen that exist in really any of the regulations we've seen in other cities, but it's something that we can look into.
Okay, yeah, and the parking, I did send you under the Q&A, like different areas that we're concerned with. I know there's nothing right now as far as enforcement goes on the 2-hour parking or the street cleaning days. Those are a big deal though for us and for our neighborhood, as far as the people that are staying, because, you know, you don't know who's coming in. They don't know that they got to move and they've got to, you know, so they either have to get a parking permit. There has to be a thing about the length of the vehicles. It says at the head of our street, no more than 2 axles in a vehicle are allowed on our street. And we had a 3-axle trailer that was 30 feet long by itself, with a billboard on the side of it that was staying for well over 24 hours. But by the time they came out, the officer didn't cite it because they said it was attached to a truck. And I had to look up the Burbank Municipal Code and I said, what? You know, and it's just wrong because that particular side of our street, those people don't have driveways. And this whole entourage that showed up had taken up the width of 3 homes. And it was on a street cleaning day. And, you know, it just goes on and on and on. But anyway, so those things could be considered as being maybe a revision or an addition for short-term rentals, a little bit different than what they allow residents, you know. That's it.
Okay, thank you so much for your comment. We really appreciate that. Next slide. And this concludes our presentation. If you still have questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to one of us. If we were unable to answer your questions during this workshop, we will post the answers on the city's website at www.burbankca.gov/STR. And thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you.